in Saudi Arabia who dared speak out against the monarchy is on trial for operating an unlicensed group. Now, he says that the charges against him are politically motivated. He says he knows the real reason why Saudi Arabia is putting him on trial. Mohammed Jamjoom has been investigating the story from Beirut, spent a lot of time in Saudi Arabia. What's this all about, Mohammed?
Well, Michael, while Saudi Arabia was never affected by the kind of large-scale protests that swept through the region as a result of the Arab Spring, recently there have been an increasing number of small-scale gatherings, and there have been growing calls for reform. Rights groups say that those who dare to express dissent or to try and demonstrate are at high risk. These men are demonstrating to win the release of their relatives. In deeply conservative Saudi Arabia, where such gatherings are prohibited, activists say these types of small protests are becoming more frequent.
We are trying to push the limit so our kids will live in a world where their fundamental rights will be respected.
Mohammed al-Qahtani is one of Saudi Arabia's most prominent human rights activists. Since 2009, he's petitioned for the release of political prisoners and advocated for reform in the absolute monarchy. His organization even crossed one of the country's ultimate red lines by being openly critical of its interior ministry, which is why rights groups weren't surprised when al-Qahtani and his colleague Abdullah al-Hamid were taken to court. Al-Qahtani was accused of, among other things, setting up and running an unlicensed organization and turning international organizations against the kingdom. Al-Hamid faces similar charges. If convicted, both men could spend years in prison.
This has been a systematic approach by the authorities in Saudi Arabia, namely the targeting and harassing activists across the country.
Al-Qahtani says he knows why he, Al-Hamid, and other activists were really put on trial.
Because we have been documenting human rights abuses carried out by the Saudi General Investigation Department. We have numbers of cases where people are thrown in prison arbitrarily, torture, forced disappearances.
Despite repeated efforts, we were unable to reach the Saudi government for comment. In this amateur video, anger overtakes tradition, purporting to show how even Saudi women have recently been taken to the segregated streets. Despite his prosecution, al-Qahtani presses on, helping them file cases against the government to free their loved ones. And while the father of five says he fully expects to be found guilty in his own trial, he has no problem going to jail for what he believes in.
Maybe I'm dreaming. Just last night I was telling my wife for my newborn daughter that maybe one day she will vote for the Prime Minister of Saudi Arabia. So we are really hopeful about the future.
And Michael, we should add that another member of al-Qahtani's group, Sliman al-Rashudi, who's a political activist and a former judge in Saudi Arabia, that he, according to his wife, was arrested last month after giving a lecture in which he said that peaceful protests were permitted in Islam. Now, I spoke to his wife, who told me that he had been jailed before on charges that included trying to overthrow the kingdom and incitement against the king and funding terrorism. She said that those charges are baseless and that she hasn't spoken to him or seen him in more than a month, and that she's extremely worried about him.
Disturbing developments. You know, Mohammed, the West, of course, calls for democratic reform in all sorts of countries, but what sort of pressure is put on the, let's face it, oil-rich Saudis?
Well, Michael, activists there say that not nearly enough pressure is put on Saudi Arabia. They say that because Saudi Arabia is the world's largest oil exporter, because it's a key ally to the West and especially to the U.S., that the West, they say, really turns its head, that they don't really pay attention to the gross human rights violations they claim are going on there. You know, there are times in the past few years when there have been cases that have gotten enough media attention that people say things. Last week, you had one instance of that. A Sri Lankan domestic worker, Rizana Nafiq, she was beheaded in Saudi Arabia. That caused a huge amount of international outrage, and that was covered by a lot of media outlets. But the human rights activists that I speak to in Saudi Arabia say, look, the West just doesn't judge Saudi Arabia by the same standards it does other countries in the region, and that it needs to start applying more pressure on Saudi Arabia to really start reforming in a more meaningful way. Michael?
As always, Mohammed, many thanks for your reporting. Mohammed Jamjoom there in Beirut.